The leather of the armchair was cool against his skin. Marco Bellini sat in the silence of his study, a silence that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. It was a purchased quiet, built on foundations of fear and respect. He held a glass of amber liquid, but did not drink. He simply watched the light refract through it, a tiny sun captured in crystal. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the sun felt warm on his face. Not just the one in the sky, but the one inside him. A warmth he had thought extinguished forever. The pain was gone. The deep, gnawing ache in his bones that had been his constant companion, his shadow, had faded weeks ago. The weakness that had made climbing a flight of stairs feel like scaling a mountain had vanished. He felt strong. He felt clear. He felt alive. A discreet knock on the heavy oak door. Enter. His voice was gravel, but it was firm gravel now. Not the shifting scree it had become during the bad months. Leo, his most trusted man, stepped inside. Leo's face, usually a mask of calm professionalism, was tight with a tension that did not belong in this room. Boss. Marco did not look at him. He continued to watch the light in his glass. What is it, Leo? You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that. Leo placed a thin file on the polished expanse of the mahogany desk. It's about the kitchen. Marco's focus remained on the glass. The kitchen was Elena's domain. The quiet woman who had arrived a year ago, a whisper in a house of shouts. The woman whose food had felt like a prayer. The chef. Marco asked, his voice low. Yes. Elena. Leo's own voice was strained. We did the deep background check you asked for. The one we do every year on all household staff. And? Leo took a breath. And we found things. Irregularities. She has a supplier. Off the books. An old woman in the countryside. For herbs. Marco finally turned his head. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, fixed on his lieutenant. Herbs are not a crime, Leo. These are not oregano, boss. They are unusual. Some are not listed in any common botany text. We had one of our contacts, a pharmacist, look at the list of transactions. He said some of these plants, in the wrong doses, are toxic. He used the word poison. Silence descended again. Heavier this time. Colder. Poison. The word hung in the air, an ugly insect. Leo continued, his words precise and damning. She has been sourcing them since she started. A little every week. For a full year. The pharmacist said a consistent, low dose, it could mimic a chronic illness. Or it could do something else entirely. He couldn't be sure without a sample. A year. She had been here for exactly 1 year. The exact length of time he had been getting better. The timeline was a perfect, damning mirror. Leo stood ramrod straight, awaiting the inevitable order. In their world, betrayal, especially of this magnitude, had only one response. Swift and final. He expected Marco to tell him to take her downstairs. To make the problem disappear. Marco looked down at his own hands. They were steady. The tremor that had plagued him was gone. He made a fist, feeling the power in it. Power he had not felt in a long, long time. Power she had, apparently, been feeding him. Or stealing from him. He thought of the meals. The simple broths when he felt weak. The rich, dark greens in his salads. The strange, earthy taste in his morning tea that she had insisted he drink. A taste he had come to associate with relief. Poison. He rose from the chair. He was taller than Leo, broader. A man built of stone and will. Where is she? In the kitchen. Prepping for dinner. Leo's hand twitched, ready for a signal. Should I have the boys? Marco raised a single, silencing finger. A break in the oldest rule. His men knew it. Leo knew it. You do not confront the viper. You cut off its head. "No," Marco said, his voice a low rumble. "Stay here." He walked past his shocked lieutenant, out of the study, and down the long, quiet hall. His footsteps were heavy and even on the marble floor. The sound of a man walking back from his own grave. He was going to the kitchen. He was going to look his poisoner in the eye. And he was going to ask her why. Marco Bellini was known as the Anchor. It was a name earned over 30 years of ruthless stability in a world of shifting tides. When other families rose and fell like waves, Marco remained immovable, unshakable. He did not start wars, but he finished them. His word was his bond, and his bond was iron. His reputation was built on a simple, brutal code. Loyalty was rewarded above all else. Betrayal was punished without hesitation. There were no second chances for traitors. No appeals. The anchor did not move. But a year and a half ago, the unshakable man had begun to crumble. It started as a deep weariness, a fatigue that sleep could not touch. Then came the pain. A dull, grinding ache that settled in his joints, his spine. It was followed by a tremor in his hands, a subtle vibration that made holding a pen, or a glass, a conscious effort. He was a man who prided himself on control, and he was losing it. Piece by piece. He went to doctors. Not his usual back-alley physicians who patched up bullet wounds, but specialists. Men with clean hands and sterile offices in the city's most expensive districts. They ran tests. They took images. They spoke in hushed, somber tones. The diagnosis was clinical. A rare, aggressive degenerative disorder. His body was attacking itself. They gave him names for it, complex and meaningless. What it meant was simple. He was dying. 6 months, one of them had said, his face a mask of professional pity. Maybe 8, with aggressive treatment. But the treatments, the side effects are severe. Marco had listened. He had nodded. He had paid their exorbitant fees in cash and walked away. He would not spend his last days tethered to a machine, wasting away under the fluorescent lights of a hospital. He was the anchor. He would go down with his ship, but he would go down on his own terms. He told no one. Not even Leo. But his body betrayed him. His face grew gaunt. His movements became slower, more deliberate. The men saw. They whispered. Rivals began to test the waters, sniffing for weakness like sharks smelling blood. He spent his days in his study, a king on a throne of pain, managing his empire through sheer force of will. He prepared for the end. He put his affairs in order, ensuring his territory would not collapse into chaos upon his death. He was resigned to it. A cold, hard fact. Then, his housekeeper had retired. A new chef was needed. The agency sent applicants. All with glittering resumes, experience in the finest restaurants. Marco had dismissed them all. He did not want fanfare. He wanted quiet competence. Then she appeared. Elena. She had no resume. No references. She just showed up at the service gate one afternoon, asking if they needed a cook. She was plain, with dark, watchful eyes and hands that looked like they knew work. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a stillness about her that was at odds with the frantic energy of the city. Leo had been about to send her away. It was a breach of all security protocols. But Marco, watching from his study window, had seen something. A lack of fear. A simple, direct purpose. Let her cook one meal, he had commanded over the intercom, the words an effort. That night, she had made him a simple chicken broth. It was nothing fancy. But it tasted clean. Pure. It was the first thing in months that didn't feel like ash in his mouth. He slept through the night without the familiar torment of the pain waking him. He hired her. It was a violation of his own rules. A ghost in his house. A nobody. But he was a dying man. What did rules matter anymore? Elena moved into the small staff apartment over the garage. She was almost invisible. She cooked. She cleaned her kitchen with meticulous care. She spoke only when spoken to. Her presence was a quiet hum in the background of his life. And her food was her language. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, things began to change. A week after she arrived, he noticed the tremor in his left hand was less pronounced. A month in, he walked up the grand staircase without pausing for breath at the landing. 3 months in, he woke up and realized the constant, grinding pain in his back was a dull echo, not a roar. He had started taking his morning tea on the terrace again. A special blend she prepared for him. It was dark and bitter, with an earthy undertone he couldn't identify. He drank it because she told him it would settle his stomach. He started eating more. Her dishes were simple, rustic. Full of dark leafy greens, strange roots he didn't recognize, and lean proteins infused with herbs that filled the house with a scent of forest and earth. By the 6-month mark, the date the doctors had given him for his end, he was walking in his garden. He had gained back the weight he had lost. The color had returned to his face. He felt good. He dismissed it as a miracle. A spontaneous remission. The will of a God he did not believe in. He never connected it to the quiet woman in his kitchen. She was just the cook. Now, the file on his desk suggested it was not a miracle. It was a prescription. A year-long treatment administered by a woman with no license, no references, and a supply chain that led to the dark, forgotten corners of the old country. A poisoner who had saved his life. Marco walked down the hall, the silence of the house pressing in. Each step was a testament to her work. Strong. Steady. Firm. The steps of a man who was supposed to be dead. He reached the kitchen door. It was slightly ajar. He could hear the soft chop-chop-chop of a knife on a wooden board. A steady, rhythmic sound. The sound of his life being extended, one meal at a time. He pushed the door open. Elena stood at the central island, her back to him. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She was focused on her task, dicing a dark, gnarled root he had never seen in any market. She did not seem to have heard him enter. Very still. Very still. He stood in the doorway, a giant of a man filling the frame, watching the woman who held his life in her hands. The anger he expected to feel was not there. The cold fury that always accompanied betrayal was absent. In its place was a vast, terrifying curiosity. Elena. Her hand stopped. The knife rested on the board. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. She simply set the knife down, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to face him. Her eyes met his. They were dark, yes, but not empty. They were deep pools holding a universe of secrets. He saw fear in them, a tremor of it. But beneath the fear was something else. Something that looked like resolve. Mr. Bellini, she said, her voice quiet but clear. He took a step into the room. The air was thick with the scent of garlic, olive oil, and something else. That earthy, bitter smell from his morning tea. The smell of her poison. The smell of his cure. He held up the thin file Leo had given him. My men are very thorough. They look into everyone. Everything. Her gaze dropped to the file, then rose back to his face. She said nothing. They found your supplier, he continued, his voice dangerously soft. An old woman. In the hills. They found records of your purchases. Strange herbs. Roots. Flowers. Things my pharmacist calls poison. He let the word hang between them again. This time, he watched for its effect on her. A flicker of something crossed her face. Not guilt. Not denial. It was sadness. Why? He asked. The single word was heavier than any threat he had ever uttered. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine plea for understanding. Why would you do this? Why would you risk everything to secretly treat a man like me? A man who would kill you for it without a second thought. Elena's hands twisted in the fabric of her apron. She looked at the floor, then back at him. Her chin lifted slightly. Because you were dying, she said simply. The honesty of it struck him like a physical blow. No games. No lies. Just the plain, terrifying truth. The doctors said so, he stated, testing her. They gave me 6 months. The doctors were wrong, she replied. They saw a disease. They did not see the cause. Marco took another step closer. He could see the fine lines around her eyes. The tiredness. This had cost her something. And you did? A cook from nowhere? You saw the cause? I saw the same thing that took my father, she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they landed in the center of the room with the force of a bomb. He stopped. Her father. My father was a botanist, she explained, her voice gaining a little strength. He worked for a pharmaceutical company. They were developing a new pesticide. Something powerful. There was an accident. A leak. He was exposed. She paused, her eyes distant, lost in a memory Marco could not see. The company covered it up. They paid doctors to create a different story. They called it a rare genetic disorder. They watched him waste away. The same symptoms. The fatigue. The pain. The tremors, her gaze sharpened, locking onto his. It was not a disease. It was a slow-acting poison. A heavy metal compound. Very rare. Very hard to trace. Marco's mind raced. A pesticide. A poison. Years ago, one of his warehouses had stored chemicals for a subsidiary of a large agricultural corporation. A corporation known for cutting corners. There had been a spill. Minor, they had called it. Contained. He had been there himself to oversee the cleanup. To make sure the problem stayed quiet. Could it be? After all these years? My father searched for an antidote, Elena continued, pulling him back to the present. He was a botanist. He believed nature had an answer for everything. He found old texts, spoke to healers. He found a combination of herbs, of roots. Chelation agents, they are called now. Things that bind to the metal and draw it out of the body. But he was too weak. It was too late for him. She looked at the gnarled root on her cutting board. But he left his research. His journals. He left the cure. Marco felt a cold dread mix with a dawning, impossible hope. He remembered the name of the corporation. He remembered the hushed meetings. The payoffs. Why me? He asked, his voice hoarse. Why would you help me? Elena finally looked away from him, her gaze falling on her own worn hands. When my father died, the company came to collect his research. They said it was their property. I ran. I took his journals and I ran. I have been running my whole life. Hiding. I heard whispers, stories. About you. That you were sick. That your symptoms were the same. She looked up at him again, and now he saw the truth of it. The desperation. The gamble. I thought, if I could cure you or the most powerful man in the city, then I would finally be safe. They would not dare to come after me if I was protected by you. It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of survival. A trade. Her knowledge for his protection. She had made a bet that his gratitude would be stronger than his paranoia. She had bet her life on his character. He thought of the past year. The slow return of his life. The quiet diligence of this woman. She had watched him every day, adjusting her doses, monitoring his progress, all while living under the shadow of discovery and instant death. What kind of courage did that take? The kitchen door swung open again. Leo stood there, flanked by 2 of his largest men. They saw Marco standing close to Elena, the tension thick enough to cut with one of her knives. They were ready to end this. "Boss?" Leo asked, his hand resting on the pistol under his jacket. "Is there a problem?" Marco looked from Leo's grim face to Elena's terrified but resolute one. Here was the choice. His code was clear. A person who acts without permission, who manipulates him, who brings a secret into his house, is a threat. A threat to be eliminated. His empire was built on that certainty. But his life, his very breath, was built on her secret. He remembered the cold finality in the doctor's voice. 6 months. He remembered the despair. The feeling of his own body turning into a cage. Elena had not put him in a cage. She had broken the lock. He turned his back on her, a sign of ultimate trust or ultimate dismissal. He faced his men. "There is no problem, Leo," he said, his voice calm and absolute. "Leave us." Leo stared, his mind struggling to process the order. "Boss, the file, the poison." "I have read the file," Marco cut him off. "The matter is closed. Elena is under my personal protection. No one is to harm her. No one is to question her. Do you understand?" The two men behind Leo shifted uncomfortably. Leo himself looked stunned, but his loyalty was absolute. He had followed Marco into hell before. He would follow him into this. "Yes, boss," he said, his voice stiff. "Understood." He nodded curtly to his men, and they backed out of the kitchen, pulling the door shut behind them. Marco and Elena were alone again. He turned back to her. The terror in her eyes was now mixed with disbelief. "The company that did this to your father," Marco said, his tone shifting from personal to business. "The one you are hiding from. Do you have a name?" She hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Agrogen Industries." Marco's face became a mask of cold fury. He knew the name. He knew the man who ran it. A man named Richard Sterling. A man who valued profit over everything. A man whose spill Marco had helped cover up all those years ago. He had been an accomplice to his own slow murder. And to the murder of her father. "They have a new head of security," Elena added, her voice trembling slightly. "A man named Silvio Gallo. He used to be in your world. He is ruthless. He is the one who has been hunting for the journals." Silvio Gallo. The name was acid on his tongue. A rival he had exiled from the city years ago for breaking the code. For hurting women and children. A man with no honor. Of course it was him. The universe had a cruel sense of poetry. "He thinks the journals are a formula for a bioweapon," she said. "He does not understand they're the cure. He wants to sell them." Marco walked over to the kitchen intercom, his movements now filled with a lethal purpose he had not possessed in years. He pressed the button. "Leo." "Boss?" The reply was instant. "Get the car. And get the team. All of them. Tell them we are going hunting." He released the button and turned to Elena. The fear was gone from her face, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. "Stay in the house," he commanded softly. "Lock the doors. No one will bother you again. Not Sterling. Not Gallo. No 1 inch." He was mobilizing his entire force. Not for territory, not for money, not for revenge. He was doing it for her. For the quiet woman who had poisoned him back to life. The plan was simple. As all of Marco's plans were. Brutal and direct. Silvio Gallo had made a lair for himself on the industrial outskirts of the city. A fortified warehouse complex where he ran his new corporate security firm, which was little more than a private army for a monster like Richard Sterling. It was there, according to Marco's sources, that Gallo was coordinating his hunt for Elena's father's journals. Marco did not want the journals. He wanted to erase the threat. Permanently. He sat in the back of his armored sedan, the city lights blurring past. Leo was in the passenger seat, issuing quiet commands into a satellite phone. In the cars behind them were 20 of his best men. Men who had not seen him lead a field operation in years. They could feel the shift. The old Marco was back. The anchor was no longer just holding ground, he was moving. Silvio has a dozen of his own men at the warehouse, Leo reported, hanging up the phone. Ex-military. Well armed. They are mercenaries, Marco said, his voice flat. They fight for money. My men fight for me. We will be in and out in 10 minutes. There was no question of the outcome. There was only the execution. They pulled up a block away from the warehouse, the street dark and deserted. The cars parked in silence, engines cutting out one by one. Men emerged, clad in dark clothing, moving with the fluid grace of predators. Marco got out of the car. He did not carry a weapon himself. He was the commander. His weapon was his will, and the loyalty of the men around him. Leo, you take the east and west entrances. No one gets out, Marco ordered. I will take the front. Give me 5 minutes with Gallo. Then, close the book. Close the book was their code. It meant no survivors. No witnesses. No loose ends. Leo nodded. 5 minutes. Boss, it's good to have you back. Marco gave a single, sharp nod and started walking toward the warehouse, 2 of his men falling into step behind him. The execution was poetry in violence. Leo's teams moved like shadows, disabling the perimeter cameras and taking out the sentries with silenced weapons before they could even raise an alarm. The mercenaries inside, comfortable and complacent, were caught completely by surprise. The fight was short, brutal, and one-sided. Meanwhile, Marco walked straight up to the reinforced steel door at the front of the building. One of his men placed a small, shaped charge on the lock. A muffled thud, and the door sprang inward. Marco stepped inside. The main floor was a cavernous space filled with crates and vehicles. In the center, under a pool of harsh industrial light, was a makeshift office. And in that office, rising from his chair with a look of disbelief and fury, was Silvio Gallo. He was a man of Marco's age, but he wore it badly. His face was puffy, his eyes filled with a cruel, petty greed. Bellini, Silvio spat, his hand reaching for a gun on his desk. You are a long way from your deathbed. I got better, Marco said, walking slowly toward him. His men stayed at the door, blocking the only exit. The sounds of suppressed gunfire from the rest of the warehouse had already faded to silence. Silvio's eyes darted around, realizing he was trapped. The bravado faltered, replaced by the cornered rat panic Marco knew so well. What is this? Silvio demanded. This is not your business. This is corporate. Sterling will ruin you. Richard Sterling is a problem for another day, Marco said, stopping in front of the desk. He looked down at the scattered papers. Maps. Surveillance photos of a woman in the countryside, Elena's herb supplier. A picture of Elena herself, taken from a distance. This is about you. Me. Silvio laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. What have I done to you? I have been out of your city for 5 years. You broke my rules then, and you are breaking them now, Marco said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You hunt the helpless. You take what is not yours. And you put your hands on something that belongs to me. What? Silvio scoffed. That little cook? The botanist's daughter? She is nothing. A loose end. Her father's work belongs to Sterling. Marco leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. The wood creaked under his weight. The full, vital power of his presence filled the small office, pressing down on Silvio. Her father was a man named Antonio. He was a good man. A man of science. He was poisoned by your boss, Richard Sterling. A poison I helped cover up, a long time ago. A poison that found its way into my body. Silvio's face went pale. The pieces were clicking into place. That man, Antonio, he spent his last days creating a cure, Marco continued, his voice relentless. His daughter, Elena, used that cure to save my life. She gave me back my time. She gave me back my strength. He straightened up, his eyes as cold as a winter sea. You were not hunting a formula, you stupid, greedy man. You were hunting the person who saved me. You were trying to take the one thing of value I have left in this world. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. This is not corporate, Marco said. This is personal. Silvio's face crumpled. He understood now. He had not just crossed a business rival. He had trespassed on sacred ground. Marco, please, he whimpered, the last of his arrogance gone. I did not know. I swear. We can make a deal. We had a deal, Silvio, Marco replied softly. A long time ago. I told you to never come back to my city. I told you what would happen if you did. He turned and walked away from the desk. He did not look back. Leo, he said, his voice calm. Leo appeared at his side, his face impassive. Boss. Close the book. Marco walked out of the warehouse into the cool night air. He did not flinch at the single, sharp sound that echoed from the office behind him. He got into his car and the door was closed. The threat was gone. Permanently. Elena was safe. When Marco returned to the house, it was bathed in the soft light of early dawn. The silence was different now. It was not the sterile quiet of a fortress, but the peaceful calm of a sanctuary. He found her in the kitchen. She was sitting at the small wooden table, a cup of her own tea held in her hands. She had not slept. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide and searching. He walked to her table and stood before her. He was still in his dark clothes, a spectre of the violence he had just wrought. But his face was calm. It is done, he said. Gallo is gone. Sterling has been sent a message. They will not bother you again. You are safe. The relief that washed over her face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. The tension she had carried for years seemed to dissolve, leaving her looking younger, softer. Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. Thank you, she whispered. He simply nodded. He felt a strange awkwardness. He knew how to command, how to threaten, how to kill. He did not know how to accept gratitude. What do I owe you? She asked, her voice gaining strength. For the herbs. For my life. You owe me nothing, he said. That is not right, she insisted, standing up to face him. She was small next to him, but her presence was not diminished. I used your kitchen. Your money to buy the ingredients. I must repay you. Marco looked at her, at the fierce pride in her eyes. He understood. She needed to balance the scales. He thought for a moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From a worn sleeve, he took out a single, crumpled $5 bill. He smoothed it out on the table. When you came here, he said, you came to trade your knowledge for my protection. You cured me. I have now guaranteed your safety. The deal is complete. He pushed the $5 bill toward her. This is your first payment. As my personal physician. Your salary. We can discuss the rest later. She stared at the bill, then up at him, a small, baffled smile touching her lips for the first time. She had gambled her life, and he was offering her a job. He saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. The same question everyone who got close to him eventually wondered. What are you? She asked softly. You are a man who people fear. A man who does terrible things. But you saved me. Are you a good man or a bad man? Marco looked away from her, toward the window where the sun was now rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He thought of the man he was a year ago, a bitter king waiting for death. He thought of the man he was tonight, a protector, a deliverer of a very specific kind of justice. He turned back to her. His gaze was heavy with the weight of his entire life. "I have been a bad man for a very long time," he said, his voice raw with a truth he had never spoken aloud. "Tonight, you gave me the chance to be something else." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently touched her arm. It was the first time he had ever touched her. Her skin was warm. Real. "You do not work for me anymore, Elena," he said quietly. "Not as a cook. Not as a physician. You stay here because this is your home now. You stay here under my protection. Always." He took a business card from his wallet. It was blank except for a single phone number. His private line. He placed it on the table next to the $5 bill. "If you ever need anything," he said. "Anything at all. You call that number." He turned and left her there, standing in the warm light of her kitchen, a $5 bill and a promise of absolute protection on the table in front of her. A new beginning, bought with courage and a strange, bitter tea. 5 years later. The garden was in full bloom. Roses climbed the old stone walls, their scent heavy in the late afternoon air. Marco Bellini sat on a stone bench, not in a suit, but in a simple linen shirt. He looked healthier, more content, than he had in his entire life. The lines on his face were still there, carved by a hard life, but they were softer now. They were joined by laugh lines around his eyes. The tremor was a distant memory. The pain was a ghost that never visited. Elena came down the path, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea. She no longer wore a cook's apron. She moved with an easy grace, a confidence that had been earned. She was his companion. His partner. The quiet center of his world. She sat beside him, handing him a glass. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. A simple, familiar touch that spoke volumes. "Leo called," she said. "The Agrogen settlement went through. They are funding a clinic for victims of the pesticide exposure." Marco nodded. After Silvio Gallo's disappearance, Richard Sterling had become much more cooperative. It was amazing what a man would do for charity when faced with the alternative. Marco had used his power not to seize territory, but to enforce a debt of blood and turn it into a legacy of healing. It was Elena's idea. "Good," he said, taking a sip of the tea. It was just tea now. No strange, bitter herbs. There was no more poison to draw out. He looked at her, at the woman who had walked into his life like a ghost and had anchored him to the world in a way his power never could. In his office, locked in his private safe, was not a gun or stacks of cash. It was a small, worn leather journal filled with drawings of plants and handwritten notes in Italian. Her father's legacy. She had given it to him to keep safe, a sign of ultimate trust. And on his desk, pressed under a glass paperweight, was a single, dried, dark purple flower. The kind that had been in his first dose of her poison, her memento. A reminder that his salvation had not come from his strength, but from his vulnerability. It had come from the quiet courage of a woman who saw a dying man and chose not to let him die. He had spent a lifetime building an empire on fear, but he had found his life in an act of trust. He was still the anchor, but he no longer held his ground in a storm of violence. He was anchored to her. True strength, he had learned, was not the power to take a life. It was the courage to save one. And sometimes, the most potent cure does not come from a sterile lab, but from the hands of someone who believes in healing, even when the world has only given them poison.